Ya alimadas, salam alaikum, and greetings everyone. My name is Zain Gulamali, and welcome to Critical Conversations. The Critical Conversation series explores the critical conversations and questions of our time within the context of our faith. It's hosted by the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board for the United States. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our topic, justice and social action in Islam. And I'd like to note that the speakers here today have graciously agreed to share their thoughts. They're the views of themselves expressed kind of during this course of this discussion. And during the course of this discussion, you'll also see a Q&A box, and you'll have the opportunity to kind of engage throughout the dialogue by posing your own questions, and we'll have some time at the end for some questions and answers. With that, let me introduce our speakers for today. Booming to you live from Victoria, British Columbia in Canada is Dr. Farouk Mitha. He's the Curriculum Development Coordinator and Course Director for Postgraduate Research Fellowship Program at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. He's also a lecturer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria in Canada, where he teaches a graduate course on theories of social justice. Dr. Mitha's current research is around the concept of culture in educational research and the teaching of Shakespeare in secondary schools. He's also previously published on topics including medieval Islamic thought, state of liberal education in contemporary Muslim societies, Canadian literature, and Iranian cinema. He previously also authored Al-Ghazali and the Ismailis, a debate on reason and authority in medieval Islam. Coming to you live from Greater Los Angeles, California in the U.S. is Justice Halim Dhanidina, of appeal on the Second Appellate Circuit in the state of California. Justice Dhanidina also serves on the boards of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change. Previously, he served as a Deputy District Attorney for Los Angeles County, a judge on the Los Angeles County Superior Court, an adjunct law school professor at a number of institutions, and finally, faculty for the B.E. Whitkin Judicial College for new judicial officers. We're really pleased to have you both here today. And while we come to you from the West Coast, we're booming to you live throughout the rest of the continent and, of course, beyond. Before we begin talking about justice and social action, I'll share a personal credo of mine from Cornell West. You can't lead the people if you don't love the people. You can't save the people if you don't serve the people. So with that, let me come to you, Farouk, first with a question about what's justice and what is this word that we talk about, adl in the Islamic tradition, and how do we measure it? What does it look like?
Sure. Well, first, let me just thank all of you, especially ITREB USA, Farhana especially, and her team for organizing this. And Zain, thanks a million for all the background sparks that you were able to provide in preparation for this conversation. And Halim, a special honor to finally connect with you. When we first heard about your appointment, even though I'm a Canadian citizen, it was a great source of pride. And thank you for allowing us not to address you as your honor on this conversation, but I may slip into that. You know, to make a good impression on a judge can always be helpful at some point or the other. But yes, well, look, I love that Cornell West quote, this idea of, you know, leading and loving and serving and saving. So let me just say, perhaps the best way to, you know, because we have shortage of time, is to think of the metaphors that they are for justice in the Quran, but that these metaphors are shared, I would argue, with all cultures and faith traditions. The first metaphor is that of the scales, the balancing. In the Quran, the term is al-mizan. And of course, to me, this is a wonderful metaphor because it's not so much about balancing once and for all, but a continuous balancing act. And that's why we have judges, you know, give opinions. At every point, they're in the process of trying to weigh what is the best opinion for any given circumstance. And this idea of the balancing act is there in the Greeks as well. And for them, when they're talking about the scales, it's always in the just city. What is the just city? And for them, the metaphor is not only of the city as something abstract, but it's the connection of the individual soul to the city. So the just soul leads to the just city. And in many ways, this metaphor in secular culture, because you know, Halim, you would know some of the insignia, you always see the balancing scales. I mean, all sorts of iconography, even in the American tradition, is the way in which we think about democracy, because democracy is a type of balancing act that's always there. And this is, the Abraham Lincoln form of by, and for the people. So that's the one area. And then the second metaphor is the metaphor of the sword. It's not so explicit in the Quran, but you have this idea of the sword of justice. And it was clearly very explicit in the Muslim dynasties. If you think of the flags, the Ottomans insignia, you have this idea of the shahada, and at some point, either behind it or in front of it, the sword. And in a way, the term adl that you used is one of the names of Allah, one of the beautiful names of Allah. And here the connotation is so much about justice as a force, and justice as a force that needs to be obeyed, need to be observed. But interestingly enough, when we think of justice in this sense as something that is a sword, they also arises a critique that can justice sometimes be blind, the blindness of justice. And that's a very interesting debate in all juridical situations, right? Because you have this whole idea that, can we ever achieve perfect justice? Can justice get it wrong? There's a terrific lecture, by the way, you must send a link out, by Halim, on the power of dissenting opinions in shaping legal thought. And that's this idea that, justice is not so much always about something that's clear cut, but it's always a process of interpretation. And in the idea of compassion also emerges when you think of justice as a sword, because if justice can be blind, justice is not always rational. What is the role of compassion? In the Shia tradition, you have the idea of Imam Ali and his sword, Zulfikar. And that too has this idea that that's the source of Imam Ali's sort of guidance. And that has a connotation of justice. The third metaphor that you find, it's not as explicit again in the Quran, but very explicit in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is justice as a tree, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. This is the tree that Adam and Eve encounter before their fall. And in many ways, that's the human condition, how we encounter areas where we either can inquire further or we don't inquire. But this is a beautiful metaphor for me because it's an organic metaphor and it's about justice as life. And this has influenced secular culture as well. And it goes to the heart of how we think about, well, clearly, the idea is that, justice is a virtue. It's one of the virtues, one of the cardinal virtues. So justice in a way shapes what it means to be human. And in a way that to be able to, in a way, to think about human growth is to also think about how justice has this sort of organic sort of life to itself. And it shapes human history in that way. And this idea of virtue has become very central for Muslim thought. Aristotle, the philosopher, talked about virtue ethics. And this, in a way, it beckons to this idea of how justice is something that is innate in us. It's something that we need to achieve. And of course, today, when I think of ecological justice, the natural world, are we listening to the earth? There's a beautiful challenge to think about justice in more than human terms. So in a way, maybe just to say that these are some of the ways in which you think about justice in Islam. There's that famous ayat al-Nur that talks about the blessed tree, shajara mubarakatan. And this is the one idea of justice as also being grace. But again, maybe I should stop there, but these are some metaphors that I think allow us to think about justice then in more critical terms.
Absolutely. Halim, do you want to share some of your thoughts on the roots? And would also love to hear kind of what you think about how to measure justice. Well, what does it look like?
Well, it's interesting because there's two primary ways. And before I jump into this answer, let me also thank everyone participating, and Zain for the introduction, Farouk for adding some intellectual heft to our discussion. I'm going to try to focus mostly on the areas that are within my wheelhouse of expertise, which is the American secular judicial system. And when we talk about justice in our courts or in our system, in so many ways, I think we're referring more to a process than we are to an end result. So by that, what I mean is, we talk a lot in constitutional law about due process of law, meaning that in our country, our sovereign is the law, it's the Constitution, it's not any person. And so we measure our fairness in society, or justice in society, I'm using it synonymously with fairness, by how equal everyone is treated. And it doesn't necessarily mean that some people always win or some people always lose, but is the process fair? It's the reason why the words carved into the edifice of the Supreme Court above the steps say equal justice under the law, meaning, there isn't any result that's guaranteed, but we're striving for this equality. Now, again, that's something that we strive for. It's not just, by virtue of it being on a piece of paper or carved into stone that we have it, because ultimately our system is a system of people, and people are flawed. And so we bring with us all of our biases and all of our mistakes, and in some ways even our bigotry, into any system that we participate in. And so when people talk about systemic racism or systemic injustice in society, it's really a reflection of us as a people, or the people who are participating in the system. And so when I think of justice in this context and social justice, I think first of the process, and then second of the people who are empowered to participate in that process.
Talk maybe a little bit about that kind of role of the minority as part of that, because you've spoken about dissenting opinions, and Farouk, you alluded to this, but what role do the voices that are perhaps less often heard from, or kind of don't shout the loudest, what role does that play?
Well, in our system, obviously, we know in a democracy, it's ideally set out to be majority rule. But in a constitutional democracy, it's majority rule with certain protections for the minority, so that the majority doesn't just run roughshod over people in the minority. And this is an idea that actually predates the Constitution. I've chosen for my virtual background, some people might recognize the set of the Broadway musical Hamilton, because one, because we're big musical fans in my family, but also because Alexander Hamilton was one of the major proponents of the Constitution that was eventually adopted. And as part of his lobbying effort, he wrote a variety of articles with James Madison and John Jay called the Federalists, or the Federalist Papers as it's referred to, where he lays out sort of what is the desired, what are we trying to accomplish with this Constitution, and sort of defending its utility in the different portions of it. And in Federalist Article number 78, Alexander Hamilton talks about explicitly the minority and how the minority should be protected in a democracy. So, without getting too much into the weeds of three branches of government, it's really the judicial branch, or the courts, that is assigned with the task of protecting the minority from what Hamilton refers to as the ill humors of the majority. So that means that if you are in a minority, it doesn't mean that you don't have any power. You may not be able to have all of the power, but you at least have enough that you're protected so that you can participate, be treated fairly, and also have your voice. When we talk about freedom of speech, among other things in our system, it means that the minority party has that power, and they have that platform to still express themselves, because as we've seen throughout democracy, most of the prevailing opinions that we have started out as a minority, and we never would have arrived at them if the minority were silenced from the outset.
Yeah, and if I can just pick up on that, it's interesting, what Halim just, described in a way is another way of thinking of jurisprudence, that how jurisprudence in a sense grows, the body of jurisprudence. It's this sort of reflection, and the ways in which the dissenting opinions drive, perhaps, as Halim is suggesting, jurisprudence. And that's equally true of Muslim history. So what we call the Sharia, and what then it became Usul al-Fiqh and the schools of law, in a sense, reflected that same process. And going back to the metaphor of the scales, that urgent rebalancing act. So in a way, there's two directions that I think for me stand out. One is the way in which it addresses equality, you know, the issue of equality. The word that we use today perhaps is human rights. That in a way, how do we talk about human rights as something common and shared for all of us? And this way of thinking about rights, although we attribute it more now to the modern period, it's there in the scripture. You know, you know, in many ways, another way to think about the life of Prophet Muhammad is that of a revolutionary, a reformer, and in a sense, trying to bring to fore certain types of human rights. It was clearly the case there with the idea of infanticide, stopping the you know, the killing of young babies, the fact that women were now being addressed independently. So you have in the Quran Muslimun or Muslimat. You had this sort of reform and revolution of moving away from tribal conflict to a larger sense of community. So, you know, that's the ways in which minority groups, in a sense, their claims are claims of recognition. They're saying that we are part of this democracy, but yet we're not being recognized. So clearly the classic way of thinking about it is what led to the abolition of slavery, right? There was the idea that these were people who felt they were not being recognized as human, and the arguments for abolishing slavery. But of course, from there, when you talk about minority rights, and by the way, as a Canadian, you often underestimate the enormous universal historical significance of the civil rights movement in the 60s in America. I mean, not only about race, but gender. I mean, when you talk about feminist thinking today, much of that wonderful energy that we have today got its fuel from that civil rights movement. Of course, there were thinkers before that, but of course also sexual orientation, disability, and you now have this idea of how do you recognize rights, and when is it that the law falls short of recognizing those rights? And I mean that's when the word social justice per se emerges, right? It's of recent coinage. It's about not only justice, but justice that goes beyond the individual. So yeah, I mean that's interesting to see how we can think about things formally, but also the significance of these sort of struggles for minority rights.
And you spoke, Farouk, about the evolution of justice there, and you spoke about some of the areas of injustice, and you know, stretching back to the 60s and even beyond that, there's been this evolution, hopefully, inshallah, in forward progress toward justice for these groups, for these entities, as we think about the broader creation. And we're having this national and global moment today, certainly cross-border. We see protests globally around the notion of racial justice, around the notion of criminal justice and reform around it, law enforcement reform. And in many ways, that's a reflection of kind of injustice in a lot of these other areas. What are some of the areas that we can explore for seeking justice today? And as you put it, beyond the individual. And I'd love both of your thoughts on it.
Do you want to take a start, Halim, or I can riff off you this time?
Farouk, I'll yield to you, and I'll piggyback on your answer.
Sure. Okay. Well, you know, I think, you know, rather than talking, first of all, about specific issues, you know, the one thing that we need to do is to give ourselves a rationale. Why should we be engaged in this? And interestingly enough, that's the way in which all sort of social justice movements have always worked, right? They talk about a rationale. So even when you look at the Quran, the rationale is something about the fact that we are all connected, the idea of a certain brotherhood, a certain universal humanity. So I think one of the things that we need to do today is to think about our interdependence. There is this amazing thinker, again, a fellow compatriot of yours, Judith Butler. And I think she said something that's always stayed with me. I mean, she's of course living and as creative as ever right now. But she says, if you only think of justice in rational terms, you're missing a lot about what the lived experience of injustice is. And so what she suggests instead, that if you were to start by thinking about justice, by postulating our common vulnerability, that we are all equally vulnerable, what would that mean for justice then? If we were all to accept that we are equally vulnerable. So it's not about justice as somebody giving somebody the rights and somebody taking the rights. It's not this hierarchical sort of relationship, but rather it's about something, what is at stake is how we live together and what sort of society can we create together. And clearly, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it's asking fundamentally, what does it now mean for us to rethink our identity as, in this case, as Americans, and how are we living together? And I think that's something that's very powerful. But beyond that, I think what is central to this idea of recognizing vulnerability is to be able to enter the lives of others. It's a very wrong way to ask the question, what does Islam say about this? What does Islam say about racial justice? Islam does not speak, it's Muslims that speak. What are Muslims doing about this? So what does it mean? The whole power of the George Floyd case was that we had this footage and we said to ourselves, we could have been him. What separated me from George Floyd? You may remember about a few years ago, there was the young Syrian boy, Kurdish boy, I believe, Turkish Kurdish, Alan Kurdi, the 4-year-old, and the photograph of him being washed up on the beach, which mobilized an incredible amount of energy around how to think about the refugee problem. So first of all, let's think about our common vulnerability, give ourselves a why, and then let's enter into the lives of others. So if you were to talk about people who feel excluded, have we not all felt excluded? What does it feel like to be excluded? So we then say to ourselves, how do I support those people who are excluded? How do I create an inclusion in democracy? If somebody is claiming to have a certain sexual orientation, which is excluding that person, rather than asking about, well, what is the stance on this or that, what does it mean to be in the shoes of that person? What does it mean to enter that person? Similarly, it's surreal today, right? The inequalities, the global inequalities that we have, the economic inequalities. And for any one of us who have worked in the developing world, it's madness that how can this level of magnitude of inequality exist in a world where there's more than enough to go around? So once you have this sense of being, well, the word I guess is empathy, but how you cultivate a very deep sense of empathy, then you will find your cause, where you want to work. But clearly, some of the flashpoints that you have in your own area, how we work around them, that's where we would go. Perhaps, we can get to specific causes that I think are meaningful for me.
And maybe we'll come back to that. Halim, do you want to provide some thoughts around kind of the why that Farouk had helped frame?
Yeah, it's almost as old of a tension or a discussion as society as itself. The extent to which we are going to be looking for competition or we're going to be looking for cooperation. And the very notion of having a society, I think, supports the idea of cooperation. People living together, people with different interests and different backgrounds living together cooperatively to strengthen the foundation of society. Now, it's probably human nature that we're always looking for competition. You always want to get a leg up on somebody else, and maybe it's a result of scarce resources. That's not imagined. That's a real thing. But I think we forget that if we're going to live in this society, what makes it strong? Is it strong because at times of challenge we've been able to work together, or is it strong because we fight amongst ourselves and we find sources of division? And I think the answer is always going to be that we've been stronger together during those times of challenge, and that's a choice. That's a choice that individuals make. We talk. I'm always very hesitant to engage too much in talks about systemic problems or systemic racism, because what it does is it absolves us as individuals of the responsibility. It's the system. It's the system's fault that something is this way, not my fault. And if everyone looks at their own individual capacity and their own individual responsibility, that's how you cure some of these problems. I think, a democracy more than any other type of society is not just a society that you have, it's a society that you do. It's about doing things and how you act within that society. I think we have a lot of hardship in our society, like any, but the human capacity, I think, to handle and deal with hardship is influenced by the extent to which we perceive fairness in that system and in our society. And if people feel like they're at least getting a fair shake, they're not being oppressed, then they will work hard and they will do what they can to try to improve their own lives and even the lives of people less fortunate. But once we start to lose that sense of fairness in society, then that oppression takes on a whole other meaning, and it undermines the validity and the confidence that we have in our system, and things start to burn down. And that probably sounds familiar, because once we teach any portion of our society that it's not credible and that these are just words, when we talk about equality, it's just words, we're not actually doing it, then people lose their stake. And once the people lose their stake in a democracy, we have nothing left.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very well put. And, and another thing, I know there might be a lot of young people listening, so many of the ways in which we are talking, these are also now become academic areas of research and study. So you can actually take courses in social justice and degrees in social justice. And there's some great institutions in the States. I think the one that really has always stood out for its courage has been University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I think they have a strong sort of social justice department there. So these are things that you can follow up. And so, the word that Halim used, systemic, I mean, this is again a type of analytical lens that was brought, and it's now becoming interrogated. And I think, Halim, you're dead on that it sometimes can be an easy way out to say that this is a systemic thing. So if the structures are unjust, so we either do two things, that we can never change it. So there's a sense of complacency or lack of engaging because it's too large to change. Or as you said, we absolve ourselves. And I think the other term that comes out when we talk about systemic is agency, human agency. And interestingly, we have to ask the question, how are we participating in these structures, in preserving these structures? How are we complicit in making sure that these structures continue? And so when you raise it that way and you say, okay, even though it's not about changing society overnight, but starting from where you are, what can you do? And the other term that I think Halim used, oppression, again, that's a lot of research around that, how we think about ways in which, in the name of democracy, people face oppression. In the name of the rule of law, or even with the rhetoric of equality and fairness, what really sort of happens to lived experiences it's very formal, it's all rhetorical. And the key term, I think, there that's emerged as a thing to interrogate is privilege. How is this oppression possible on the basis of our privileges? And how do we look at ourselves in the mirror? What privileges do we carry? So of course, in critical race theory, you have this idea of white privilege or even class privilege. And that, I think, is a very generative thing for our community, because it's a way of holding up a mirror to ourselves to say that, what are our blind spots? What have been our privileges that we have sort of not only taken for granted, but not questioned? I was born in Uganda, and I left Uganda when I was about 11 or 12. And I've been back since several times. And clearly, I mean, this was a divided society. When the colonists came, it was very much the British at the top, the Asians in the middle, and the blacks at the bottom, economically and even politically, even post-independence. But, very few of us in the community started asking, is this all right? Is this system all right even now? What have been some of the racist attitudes that we have sort of not interrogated, even in the way we speak about Black people? And so, it goes on. I mean, this is the way in which I think there can be something very constructive that happens.
Farouk, your research kind of centers in and around kind of multicultural education. It's interesting, kind of going all the way back to the 2000s, you were using nomenclature like anti-racist education. You know, and you're talking now about kind of being vocally self-critical as a community, community looking inward. What are some ways that you think practically the attendees here on the call can kind of tomorrow or today sort of take back that education theme and educate themselves about the other, and try to start to learn about what the injustices are that everyone else is suffering from, so that you can compel yourself to having that empathy that drive for justice?
Again, I can only speak from personal experience, but start creating these conversations. If you are a Mukhi and Kamria, inshallah, the Jamaat Khanas will open soon. We're all waiting for that. But to the extent to which we can allow young people to come together, to talk, to discuss, to share what they think we need to learn about, what we need to do. In Canada, it's the issue of the indigenous peoples, the First Nations people. And there's a woeful ignorance in the community and who the indigenous people are, what are the different nations. So one thing that I think we can do is, and that's that sort of peer education. And you'd be amazed the type of talent that we have in our Jamaats, people who are actually doing this sort of work, and bring them into our programming. I think there's always a fear of the unpredictable consequences, and that's rightly so, because the institutions have a lot that they carry, a lot of responsibilities that they carry, and whatever we say here can have repercussions outside our own Jamaats internationally. But I think if we take this responsibly and we allow a certain discussion, what is interesting is that we would have no difficulty organizing something about global poverty, right? So why is that? Why is talking about global poverty not going to get people scared? Or climate change? But when we move to maybe race, or when we move to issues of exclusion in our society, why does that become more risky? I mean, it's an interesting question to ask. And I think it's maybe a coming of age process. But most of our young people will be studying these in their schools. So one of the approaches that our institutions can take, and we, is to realize that we need to mirror what is happening in public education in the wider society. We often do that with remedial stuff on the sciences and what have you, setting up students for success. Why not see this as an equal part of what it means to be successfully educated, to be able to be informed about your own society? But yeah, you're taking me back to the days when I was, talking about this, but that's a long story. But I had a very strange sort of entry point. I was looking at a play called Othello, and I was asking, is it a play that is critiquing racism, or is it a racist play? And that's an interesting debate. But that's another story. And I think, a play like Hamilton is another interesting example of how the arts, maybe I'm taking a bit of a tangent, but if we allow young people to express some of these things through their aesthetic sensibilities, through the work of the imagination, through music, through art, sometimes is so very powerful. It's so very powerful, because you run out of words after a while in terms of, what does it mean to have a just society? How does it mean to live together harmoniously? But artworks keep on challenging us. And in a sense, they capture the complexity of all the tensions. And I think the other thing to realize is that this is hard work. Anybody who's an activist who wants to sort of work on the field line, it's hard work. And part of the hard work is how we build coalitions, how we build some sort of group that can stay together. And then how we think about our strategies, who we are addressing, and that sort of organizing for young people, don't see it as simple. And also, living with difference is not easy. It's easy in the abstract, it's easy in theory, but actually making space for difference. And one of the reasons why I think it's difficult is because we often think of the other in the abstract, but we have to enter into really deep and meaningful relationships. Many of you may have African-American colleagues and friends. What does it mean to enter their lives? You may have First Nation, the American Indian friends. I think that's what you call them, that group in America, or the First Nations groups.
Native American.
Native Americans. But yeah, I think that's one thing that we can start doing, is creating these safe spaces and realizing that this, in a sense, is part of our faith tradition. It's part of the ethics of our faith.
Absolutely. Halim, how do we think about this notion of social action? And I think, Farouk, you teed this up with regard to kind of educating ourselves through conversation and active embrace and entering into the lives of those whom we seek to affect and uplift, inshallah. But social action, what forms does that take? How can we propel ourselves toward that? Or is there a single form?
Well, I think it comes in multiple forms, but I think in order to start at the beginning, we have to be inward looking, because before you can change the hearts and minds of people, you have to make sure that your heart and your mind is in the right place. And sometimes it's easier said than done, because we all, we're all reasonable people, and we would be the first ones. Like, if, it's funny, when I would be in court, when I was on the trial court and I'd be picking a jury, I would have to ask the jurors various questions about themselves. And, when I would ask the question, who here has any bias against any group? Not a lot of hands go up, surprisingly, but could that be true? And I think we have to be aware of this.
In LA?
Only the people who really want to get off the jury will raise their hand. But generally speaking, we're not aware of our own biases. And it's this concept often referred to as implicit bias. It's something that's actually become a major part of judicial education in California, that you may act and you may react to a situation based on a bias you're not even aware of, or you're not even aware that it's playing a role. And so that it gets incredibly hard, as Farouk was talking about. This is difficult work, right? How do I prevent myself from acting on a bias I don't have? It can be very challenging, but it's something that we should be striving towards, at least recognizing and addressing before we then reach out. And then I think Farouk used the perfect word. It's a matter of education, and we need to really question where we get our information from and why. I think so many of us look for sources of information either on television or on the internet, and we're not really looking for actual challenging information. We're looking for someone that agrees with us already. And this is also referred to sometimes as confirmation bias, because it makes us feel good. You want to watch something at the end of the day after a hard day's work. You don't want to watch something that's going to challenge you and make you uncomfortable and frustrated. I've felt that. You want someone who is going to tell you that you're right about everything, and someone with a platform to tell you that your opinions are valid opinions and correct. But that's not really what education is. I try to teach my kids, and both of my children are very young, but I try to teach them that an inherent part of education is always questioning information, right? We've all been given intellect, right, from God. How do you use that intellect, right? Intellect is not just soaking up things that come at you. It's questioning it. It's testing it. It's deciding for yourself as an individual what's correct and what's not. And if I would encourage people that if they receive information, it's not like there's some legitimate sources and illegitimate sources. Wherever they get it, from a teacher, from a newspaper, from the internet, always ask yourself, one, does this make sense to me? Two, does the person who's telling it to me have some sort of an interest or a bias of their own in communicating that? And always test it, because that's the only way you're going to know the truth. If you were to go out shopping for a car, you wouldn't just go to the first dealership you drove to and ask the salesperson, which car should I buy? You would do your own research, and then you would shop around. Why don't we shop around for information? I don't know. Maybe because it's difficult, or because it makes it so that we don't get that confirmation bias that we want. So I think that's the first step, is making sure that you educate yourself and you get information and you're always asking those questions. And then beyond that, we have so many different outlets in society. I think the Imam has been very clear. You can get involved in almost any aspect of our society to make our community better. It doesn't have to be through politics, but you could run for office. You could get involved in a political cause. You could get involved in a social movement. You could do, as Farouk was indicating, write on the topic, teach on the topic, reach out to other communities so that we're not always in this bubble. And it's more than just saying, you know, some of my best friends are Black, right? It's actually learning those experiences by building relationships. If you build a relationship with someone who is not like you, that is the best way to find empathy and to see things through their eyes. And then once you are able to see a problem or see an issue through someone else's eyes, that puts you in the best position to understand it and also to help possibly solve those problems.
Yeah, no, it just reminded me of this. This is a true mystery that needs to be solved, right? Most people will agree that there is racism, but I've yet to meet a person who claims he's a racist. It's actually quite a miraculous mystery, right? I mean, there's a sense in which everybody exists that racism is there, but nobody wants to ever call himself a racist. So where is the oxygen for racism? But, you know, going back to what Halim was saying in terms of what is happening in the community, another thing I want to bring about, and perhaps, you know, we can share about what it meant to be growing up in the Ismaili community. But what was truly, truly a blessing is the way in which our community encourages seva and khidmat. And to me, those are the seeds of activism. I remember being a volunteer, you know, right in East Africa as an 8 or 9-year-old, and how I was literally socialized in a very embodied way of what it meant to support, what it meant to give, and how it was valorized and celebrated. And through that, of course, I saw role models of people selflessly giving of their time, and the enormous ways in which the community, this was the lifeblood of the community. So we have this, you know, we are in many ways a remarkable community, small with the big dreams, and even the leadership, the countless time, the sacrifices they make when they are appointed, it's truly inspiring. And so perhaps this is a coming of age moment, and we have been reaching out outside the community, but it's finding this energy and seeing what we can do. You know, one of the key terms that is used in social movement organizing is building coalitions. And maybe that's something we can think about. How do we build coalitions? Now, I know, Halim, you work with the Jewish community. You may want to speak about how you saw that coalition, and is that possible within the community? And that's something I think that holds out a lot of promise. And you know, if there's anything that is going to be remembered about the Imamate institutions, it's this amazing and almost seamless shift that took place from the time of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, where these institutions were built to serve the community. And in a matter of not even 50 or 40 years, how they became institutions that served more than the community, how they served with this very universalist aspiration. Regardless of one's background, you could benefit from the Imamate institutions. And in that sense, it's that movement that we, coming from insulated, closed backgrounds, have been gradually opening up and entering the public stage. And this may well be a time where we can see ourselves making these wider contributions, and we're well posed to do that. You know, there are a lot of promising young scholars in Islamic studies that are emerging, and I wish them great success and strength, but I'm sometimes concerned how they talk about our theology and our concepts in very exceptionalist terms, as if we are a community apart. And that to me is dangerous. You know, that to me is dangerous. I keep on saying to these people, the very thinkers you're quoting, Nasr Khusro, Nasruddin Tusi, and when they talk about Qiyamah, if they were alive today, how would they be writing about that concept? They would be connecting it to social justice issues, to issues of what is happening in the sciences. And that universalist outlook is very, very important.
Yeah, Halim, if you want to talk about, I think it's a great opportunity to kind of talk about the New Ground Muslim-Jewish Partnership. I had the opportunity to attend one of their iftars during Ramadan, and it was great. Had great conversation with my Jewish brothers and sisters. Wondering kind of what led to your involvement there, and what are some of the things that you've been able to work on through that?
Yeah, so this is an organization, Muslim Jewish New Ground. It was started in Los Angeles, and it basically focuses on relations between the greater Muslim community and greater Jewish community, both of which, as everyone knows here, have tremendous diversity within each community. But finding ways that we can have constructive relations with each other rather than constantly being in conflict. And one of the things that we focus on is the extent to which conflict is a choice. The way that you interact with someone, if it's in a spirit of conflict, it's because you've chosen to do that. Sometimes we believe from a very young age, as Farouk was talking about, we're almost indoctrinated into thinking that certain things are baked into the dynamic. I remember growing up in an area that was heavily Jewish, watching what I would describe now as propaganda films in school about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it almost taught me from a very young age that these are two communities that are at odds historically for thousands of years and will always be so, without really even questioning it. And that's dangerous, because I think if people in the Muslim communities and the Jewish communities are raised this way from childhood, then they carry those attitudes with them into adulthood. And so what Muslim Jewish New Ground does is it creates a forum for people to almost be re-educated and to learn to have conversations that are difficult, even on things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is kind of an area of major intransigence, I think, on both sides. It's hard to have that discussion with someone if you feel like you're coming from a position that's so inherently correct, and everyone feels that way. So the real value in that organization is not to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, but to teach people that there actually is a way you can have constructive, difficult conversations, which is the first step towards solving some of these intransigent problems in society. You have to learn how to talk to each other before you can actually solve those problems. And this is something that is inherent in the American experience, I think. Sometimes you take people from communities that abroad, in the home country, had this inherent conflict. And then when you come to the United States, you start to see yourself, some commonality between yourselves. Certainly since 2016, people in the Muslim community and the Jewish community are looking around and seeing all of these examples of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and real true oppression, and beginning to look at each other more like, the cousins that we are, rather than constantly being in conflict because of this shared experience. We forget sometimes that, even in this age of polarization, I hear a lot of people acting very despondent, saying, how can I even talk to someone on the other side of an issue when everyone's digging their heels in and nobody actually wants to have any kind of compromise? How do you compromise over something like racism, right? You have a racist and a non-racist, and is there some middle ground, like be halfway racist? No, of course not. But we forget that, the founders of this country, in choosing to coalesce and to form a society, had people who really had no basis for agreeing on a lot of things. You had people who thought it was okay to own human beings, and you had people who thought that was the worst evil you could commit. And yet those people got together and actually agreed to form a society where they could all operate and all debate and discuss issues, because the consequence of not having that unity was worse. And I think we maybe need to be reminded of that. We can be in a fighting stance, and we can certainly gather together the troops and go out there and fight the other side. But to what end? Is it a fight that you win, or is it a fight where everyone loses? Or is it better to find a way where we can still work together and disagree, but still be part of the same society? And I think that's the challenge that's posed to each generation. And now our generation is grappling with that.
I love that reminder for us to come together. And before we turn to some of the audience's questions, and there's been a lot of excitement around kind of some of the topics we've talked about. So we'll get to those in a second. But one last one, maybe to tee up for both of you. You talked a lot about looking inward. And so I'm wondering, what's the role of kind of looking inward to our community institutions? And is this sort of compassionate, constructive self-examination that we can do on ourselves, is that part of this quest for justice? And how can we do so in a way that that balances kind of the empathy and the constant striving forward that we're looking for?
Okay, should I?
Or maybe you want to start, and then Halim, maybe you can wrap.
Yeah, I know, and in a way, in different ways, we've been riffing off this conversation. You know, initially, we made a joke. Let's sort of try to be like jazz musicians and improvise. Hopefully, we've got a nice fugue going on. You know, one of the things I think to focus on is in terms of how we are structured as a community. There's maybe some reflection about that. You see, one of the things that I found, and I can give a concrete example. When I used to attend conferences about 15, 20 years ago, and mostly when I would meet my fellow Muslim academics, they were mostly Sunni. So they would often say, well, Farouk is a different sort of Ismaili. You know, Farouk is not like the other Ismaili. So in a sense that somehow, you know, I was some sort of pseudo-Sunni or something. You know? But they would sort of maybe discount this, you know, because what have you. But over the last 5 or 6 years, when I've been attending conferences, same very colleagues, they email me before the conference, look, I want to book time with you for lunch. I want to really know more about what you're doing in your community. How have you achieved this incredible gender sort of, you know, gender representation in your community and what have you? So there's been a shift. The perception has been, rather than seeing us in this very sort of theological frame in terms of where we stand in terms of our beliefs, they're seeing that we walk the talk, that somehow we're getting things done and we're doing things. And that's something we should take great pride in. But as I start talking to my fellow colleagues, they're actually thinking that we have this grassroots activism in our community. And it's been agitating, that we have this grassroots feminists in our community that has pushed the agenda. And they're quite disappointed when I say we don't quite have it that way. What we have is enlightened leadership that guides us, and they're quite confused because progressive politics always starts from the ground up, and that's the only way it can be sustained. So what I'm trying to say is that what we need to do is we need to be a bit more decentralized in the way we approach things. You know, the Jamaat in Atlanta is very different from the Jamaat in Chicago, very different from the Jamaat in LA, the youth in these different. And how do we release local energy? This is how the churches work. It's very church-based activism. So I know we are so always keen in terms of quality assurance to make sure that things work out together. But in the process, you could stifle local grassroots energy. So what I'm saying is that find a way to trust that there can be local creativity, which will look very different. Because if we're going to have a genuine engagement with progressivism, it has to start with the ground up for people to face those difficult conversations as Halim was talking about. You know, you may find people in the Jamaat who may be very clear about the very negative experiences they've had with certain minority groups, and would be more concerned about sharing those negative experiences. And you might someone on the other hand who knows what these minority groups are suffering, and their main attempt would be to convince you that, look, you know, we need to. So how do we get these sort of people together and to start talking? Now I forgot exactly what was the punchline of your question, but was it something along these lines?
You're delivering the punchline in progress. I love it. It's as you said, a jazz piece or a freestyle rap as I'm accustomed to. But I think your call to decentralization and sort of community participation at the individual level and hearing those voices, I think is one that we can kind of take away, certainly.
And let me again just end, you know, the First Nations communities here, they have this very special place for the elders in the community, the wisdom of the elders. And it's there in the African American community as well. And I think we have some elders, some role models. You know, randomly, I can talk about at least 3 people that have had a huge influence on me. And I'm surprised, it'll be very interesting to know how many of you will recognize their names, because they're probably outside the community radar. But there is a Professor Isa Shivji. He's now an emeritus professor at the University of Dar es Salaam. But he was single-handedly responsible for changing, instigating land reform legislation in Tanzania. And he worked with 5 years. He's a senior figure. And even if you look him up, Isa Shivji, Professor Isa Shivji, and he's so rooted to the Tanzanian context. And he was able to achieve a lot. For those who come from a Pakistani background, there's Professor Pervez Hudbai, a nuclear physicist who's been a very, very incredibly articulate peace activist. He's the only Pakistani scientist that Indian television is able to interview on their shows. Look him up. And for those who come from a Pakistani background would know that his father was the great Dr. Hudbai, who served the Jamaat with amazing dedication. And when he passed away, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's Talika is something to read. And of course, there's a dear friend, a fellow American to all of you, Professor Ferial Ross Sharif, who taught at Howard University for over 40 years. And to access what that must have been like. And then she's done work in starting Aluma, in working in global poverty, the global poverty project when she was part of the LIF. So we have some of these, if you will call, role model elders that we can find inspiration from.
Oh, that's super helpful. I mean, I think the reminders of those examples is ever needed. Halim, maybe you can kind of come in on this thought of compassionate, constructive criticism of our community institutions and kind of what form that would look like.
Yeah, I think this is a really key point, because when people get challenged, I think it's sort of as a gut reaction, they want to get defensive. And when you're defensive, you're not really listening. So I think it's incumbent on people who are in leadership or people who are in a position of influence to be always asking themselves this question of, what can I be doing better? What mistakes am I making? And to listen to people. That's not to say that, any criticism that you receive is going to be in good faith, but a lot of it is. And, as a community moves forward, just through time, generation to generation, I think it's important that we make sure we're not alienating each generation that comes after. Because usually what ends up happening is the generation that's in control will run things the way they want and will not really listen so much to the people coming up after. And that's a mistake, because if you lose the generation coming after before they mature, then you may never get them back. And I think it's really important. They're the people, the youngest people among us are the ones who are going to ask the questions that we can't conceive of ourselves, because their experiences, and it's how society evolves, and our community is no different. Our community has evolved in some ways slowly in some areas, but it has evolved over time. And that evolution is only possible when we look at the energy and we look at the perspective of young people in kind of trying to question whether we're always doing things the right way or the wrong way, and to have that conversation. So I think it's a symbiotic type of dynamic where people in leadership, listen to those who do not have the power and the influence in order to maintain the credibility of the institution. The way that I talked about in our society and in democracy in America, once the leaders lose touch with those people that they're leading, then the credibility of the institution starts to falter, and it has no foundation. And I think that's a really perilous path to take as a community.
Absolutely. I think lessons for us all as current leaders, hopefully future leaders, past leaders, but all together participants in a great community. With that, we'll turn to our broader community of listeners and appreciate those who've chimed in with questions. One of the questions that was posed was, is thinking about social action, if you're absent from the dialogue, from the action itself, does that make us complicit in injustice? Halim, maybe you can start that off, and would love to hear kind of thoughts from the legal jurisprudence body that you studied, but also many other traditions that you incorporate already?
Yeah, again, like I've indicated, democracy is something that you do. It's not something that you have. And so you can sit on the sidelines. And I think, I don't want to pass this version of people because life is hard. And, people have enough trouble trying to figure out what they're going to do with their career and their education and their families to think about some of these larger societal issues. But it's imperative that we understand that if we care about these issues, you can't just keep your head down or keep your head in the sand. It's sometimes said, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. I think that's true. And you can only ignore some of these issues for so long and at your peril. Especially because, again, we're not talking about involvement being something as extreme as, running for city council or something like that. It's a way you can get involved. It's not the only way. You can get involved by becoming educated and becoming an educator and trying to get involved in any type of, we all try to involve ourselves in volunteer work and community work in some respect. It's part of our faith. This would be a perfect avenue to do that. And I think if you stay too much on the sidelines, I don't want to say you're necessarily complicit, but we get in a democracy, you get the leadership you deserve, you get the society you deserve. If there's an election where someone is elected and it blows your mind, you can't believe that this person is elected, and you think they're just horrible, well, don't blame that person. They're going to be who they are. Don't even blame the person who voted for that person, because that's a society we have. Blame the people, and maybe it's you too, blame the people, the good people who stayed home and didn't vote at all. It's that level of responsibility that I think it behooves all of us in this society to take part of. We're not in some society where you don't have a voice. We all have our voice. And if we don't use it, it's a wasted opportunity.
Farouk, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, and the only thing that I can add, it's a very good question. The whole idea is, what do you do with your knowledge and your awareness, right? That's when you have to really have a moral dilemma, that if you know clearly that this is something that's wrong, you're clearly aware of what's happening, and you ask yourself, well, either I'm powerless or I don't know what I'm going to do next. But the very fact of recognizing it as an injustice and naming it, that's the first thing to do. To know that, look, I have to struggle with my own conscience, but I can't whitewash this. And this is, I think, the crisis today, right? For so long, we have many ways of justifying that we are progressing in our society. Whether it's trickle-down economics, or whether it's, oh, well, look at what we've done here, look at how much progress we've done here. And yet when we hear the experiences of people who say, well, look, it's not working for us, we have to, in good faith, be able to listen to what that lived experience is like. But I suppose, the point is, no one is asking anybody to be some sort of hero and that everybody's going to change the world. But it's a type of, if you will, it's a way in which it affects how you then live your life. And it's questions really fundamentally of humility, of being open to learning. Because, again, another paradox of the human condition is that we are deeply social, we are deeply relational, and thus inevitably we are always constructing the other. We can't avoid constructing the other. But we have to ask ourselves, are we constructing the other to pass judgment or to somehow talk about our own superiority, or is it a way in which to say, this is something I want to learn more about? And if it's not, if not, why is it that you are not willing to learn more about this experience? Clearly that applies to all three of us as men here. How do we enter what is the experience of being a woman, career woman, a woman who has a family and is a career woman, and the ways in which we have a long way to go around gender discrimination?
Absolutely. Another question came up, and I'll kind of harken back to 1995, the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., and there was a lot of call on individual responsibility, individual action to make change. And at one point in time during the course of that day, there was a call that if they don't pick up your trash, you pick it up. You pick it up and take out the trash. And at some point in time, people started to say, well, shouldn't that be the role of government? Shouldn't that be the role of the system, effectively, right? And trash here is a metaphor for broader caretaking of society. We talked about individual responsibilities. We talked about community responsibilities. And we talked a little bit about the government and the broader system and the reform that takes. But does just kind of focusing on the individual absolve the system of responsibilities? And in what ways can we start to propel action there? Halim, I know you've talked a little bit about this and the many formats it takes, but we'd love more thoughts on.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it behooves us to see the relationship between the individual and the so-called system, right? You know, obviously it becomes many steps removed, right? So if the government, if the system is not picking up your trash, you can be angry with the system, and that will frustrate you, and there'll be trash in front of your house, right? So it doesn't mean that something's not fair or something is not right, but then how do you participate, right? If you live in society, you have a voice in choosing who your leaders are and hold them accountable for when they pick up your trash or when they don't. So it's not enough just to say, look, this isn't getting done for me, because you're going to be left in a worse off situation. So I think it's both. I think it's not either criticize a system or do it yourself. It's both. But you can't do one without the other, because if you do, you're not going to get anything accomplished ever, right? I mean, the problem with our society, which is also the best thing about it, which is it requires our participation in order to work. And there's a great deal of power in the law and in our structures, in our institutions. And anytime you have power can be misused to favor one group or to oppress another group. And so the only way that you can kind of get involved in that is by participating. Otherwise, you're going to be, you know, like, have you heard the statement, you know, you can't fight City Hall. You don't want to be that person trying to push a boulder up a hill. You need to be that person who's going to organize and get people involved and flex your muscle a little bit. You know, there was, without getting too much into politics, in 2008, there was a prevailing thought initially in that election cycle that someone with the middle name of Hussein is not getting elected president of the United States. But through organization and activism, it happened. And so there's not a lot that's really impossible if you're willing to take the initiative and fight injustice where you see it. Because injustice anywhere, it's been said, is injustice everywhere. And we all have that power. So rather than getting frustrated and angry with the powers that be, finding ways to influence those powers, I think, is the most constructive thing you can do. And not to mention, I think it's good for you spiritually. It empowers you. It makes you feel like you're not at the mercy of other people, even if the odds are stacked against you.
Yeah, and that's wonderfully put. And you know, it brings into sharper focus what a strange time we're living through, especially in Western democracies, or at least some of them. This political polarization, where you have this type of extreme right-wing thinking that really, you know, there is a threat of left-wing socialism that's going to take us over and what have you. And then you have this, you know, the reaction from the left, sort of seeing this very, very self-serving economic system that needs to be radically changed. And there's been this more and more, this polarization. And it's very interesting, or in a way tragic, to see what will happen out of this polarization. But I think what Halim is saying, that's hopefully we'll get beyond that we don't need to think in terms of these binaries, you know, that less government is good, or, you know, moving towards completely a complete investment into the public sector at every level is also the best formula. It'll have to be some sort of middle ground that we need to recover. And in fact, Hazar Imam, when he uses the term civil society, this is what he has in mind. When he's talking about civil society institutions, he defines it in a very simple way to start with, that it's institutional movements or organizations that are not driven by market forces, nor are they completely dependent on public funding, government funding. And that level of that intermediate space. And you know, for many people who get to know the institutions of the Ismaili community from the outside and they first encounter, they almost see ourselves as a model civil society organization because we don't take funding from the government. You know, in Canada, there was a time when there was a lot of support for faith communities, but we would refuse government funding. We wanted to not be beholden. And so this idea of civil society, civic engagement is very, very, very important. And you know, one of the examples that I think is not sufficiently praised is Wikipedia. I mean, you know, if you think of Wikipedia, I mean, it's an incredible achievement. Here you have, when it was first proposed, can you imagine when it was first proposed, if you said that we want to create an online encyclopedia, which would be up to peer review standards, but edited by volunteers. I mean, people at Encyclopedia Britannica just laugh. Yeah, dream on, right? It's going to be some sort of overnight mishmash. And yet I have friends who spend up to 4 to 5 hours a week editing Wikipedia pages in their areas of research for no monetary remuneration at all. So when you talk about what is possible, that, you know, now today, that's probably the first place we go to, and you constantly people, I mean, that's the power of civil society, that it can create mobilization around these sort of things. But yeah, I think that this is, I think you're right, as Halim said, that, you know, it's so easy to think of ourselves completely as individualists or completely beholden to government support, but that's the wrong way to think about things.
I love the reference to Wikipedia, because I think it's one of the greatest ways that we've seen in today's internet age around kind of sharing knowledge globally and democratizing access. And we've talked about how do we advance these democratic ideals, and access is a big part of that. So I love that example. One last question. Maulana Hazim's talked a lot about the role of discovery of knowledge and sharing of knowledge as part of the Islamic ethics. To what extent does that sharing and application of knowledge, and even the discovery of knowledge, play a role in driving forward this quest for justice? And maybe if there's a personal example or particular individuals that you've come across that have just been that shining example of a knowledge leader that's really helped advance justice, would love to hear about that. Maybe Halim, if you want to start that.
Well, you know, I think I can talk in very general terms about what that dynamic that Maulana Hazri Imam talks about, what it means to me. And, you know, he is always talking about our community playing the role of ambassador. And it could be in a very specific way, sort of ambassador for the Muslim world, for the West, and kind of playing that role. But I think being an ambassador really has to do with education. It has to do with taking yourself and taking all of the knowledge and the resources and abilities that you have amassed as an individual and sharing them. But to never forget that it's, you know, you hear about each one teach one as sort of a concept. I think it's more important, instead of to think of ourselves all as teachers, to recognize that at every given time in your life, you're a teacher and a student. And so you should constantly be looking for more information and more sources of education, at the same time imparting what you know to somebody else. So to think of it more like a ladder, where at any given time you're reaching your hand up and you're also reaching your hand down to bring the next person up behind you. I think our community has been very strong because the dynamic of mentorship is so strong in our community. You know, we have people in all aspects of our personal and professional lives that we look up to. And then we also, I think, spend a lot of focus on bringing up that next person behind you. I can say professionally, for example, you know, I've advanced now pretty far in my career, which is evident in part by how much white hair I have. But even at this day, I have people that I consider to be mentors of mine. And, you know, I sit on the State Court of Appeal. So I always encourage people to find ways that they can not only share their knowledge, but never forget to keep amassing it themselves. And that's how we can lift everyone. And I think in the area of social justice, that's especially true, because, you know, we all believe as a concept, social justice is a good thing, but I don't think any of us know everything that there is to know about it. And there are very eloquent, intelligent scholars in this area that, you know, people like Dr. Cornel West that Farouk was talking about before, that have so much to share for us that it's part of our responsibility to gather that information and then to also impart it to other people.
Yeah, you know, in fact, you know, we are right in the mid-flight of this very historical phase in human history, you know, this COVID crisis, and how we're going to sort of come out of it at the other end. It's still going to be open, but clearly it has forced us to rethink many of our certainties, right? Our economic certainties. Clearly the free market failed in response to how we were going to address the needs of what would happen if you were struck by such a pandemic. Have our political system been up to the game? Have we been able to coordinate effectively? And in fact, this larger question about our balance with the natural world, how do we live with the natural world? So all of these areas, I think, are going to generate. I'm a somewhat of an incurable optimist, but I think this is going to be an incredible springboard, a renaissance for rethinking our paradigms of how we govern ourselves in terms of ecology, in terms of even the way we are thinking about who we are as human animals in the ecology, in the ecological system. And I think, you know, that idea, what will we do with that knowledge? We're already seeing the amazing work that's being done in search for a vaccine, the amazing reorganizing that's taking place in terms of how we are running our institutions, how much ingenuity it's taken to keep, you know, our institutions running, although we can't be there presently. So that is forced us to be very creative. And I'm hoping that we will learn the right lessons. It's always going to be very contested because there are competing interests at stake. And so it's going to be a power struggle. But I think, you know, clearly, I think what the questionnaire was asking, that's so very important. And another area of knowledge that when we talk about discovering knowledge, it's not so much bookish knowledge, but it's learning from the experiences of other people. When we think about this whole movement of people calling themselves non-binary and requesting and now having legal provisions for gender-neutral washrooms, I mean, that for me was an amazing discovery. It showed my ignorance. What does it mean to be in the shoes of a transgendered person? And what does it mean to understand that struggle that they've been carrying? And similarly, you can see, so don't often just think of what it means to learn something in some sort of formal way, but being open to human experience. And of course, my great teacher always is the natural environment, the wilderness. I mean, that's where in a way I'm most in touch with myself. And you know, the idea that the indigenous communities always have is always thinking 7 generations forward. Nelson Mandela used to often say that we are 7 generations deep, or somehow 7 degrees deep. You know, there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, he was asked, what is this concept of ihsan? It's not easy to define in English. You have Islam, Iman, and ihsan. It's almost like an inner virtue, a type of, it sometimes gets loosely translated as charity. But he put it very beautifully. He says, ihsan means that when you pray as if you're in the presence of God. And even though you cannot see God, you should know that God sees you. And for me, I always sort of adapt it like any good jazz musician would do, to say that whenever we do work, we should do work as if we're in the presence of future generations. And even though we cannot see the future generations, we should know they will be able to see us. And what will they see? We can see Martin Luther King. He was unable to see me. I was very young when he passed away. We can see, we can see the great revolutionaries from the past. So this idea of working for a better world, and Hazrat Coffin talks about it. What does it mean to create a world for generations yet to be born?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, inshallah, this will be an inspiration for those 7 generations forward, and hopefully we'll live in the tradition of those 7 generations back, and indeed will be a reaching down and reaching up and propelling forward. So want to thank both of you, Halim and Farouk, for the great thoughts, for the learnings, and inshallah all of you in the audience benefited from it, and thank you all for the gift of your time, for attending, asking great questions. After this, we'll share some resources in the chat, and hopefully over email if you don't get those. And just want to leave you all with that inspiration of be engaged, engage yourself in social action in this quest for justice, and live the virtue of Islam that we talked about. In terms of kind of some housekeeping items, next week we're going to be taking a break from our weekly cadence of these critical conversations, the weekend of Imamat Day, so we'll resume the weekend after. And then we've got some upcoming events that'll help contextualize and further the conversations here. In Imamat Day, young adult conversations around guidance and leadership in Shia Islam, exploring the Imam-Murid relationship. That'll take place on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 8 p.m. Central. And then another upcoming event, the Ismaili Imamat, Values and Expressions. It's part of the Aspire series. And this will be hosted by Dr. Shainul Jiva. That'll take place on Wednesday, the 8th of July at 8 p.m. Central. Look out for information on the next critical conversation, as well as some of these other events on v.ismaili and related social media properties. We'll also add the registration links in the webinar. And we hope that you all give us feedback and help us to improve and benefit the Jamaat in many ways through the survey that we'll post at the end of this session. With that, I think, we'd love to just once again thank Farouk and Halim for enlightening us and leaving us with some thoughts that hopefully we'll reflect on throughout the day and throughout these coming months.
And thank you, Zain, for coordinating this with such skill. You should think about career in broadcasting. And by the way, I was resisting not greeting my fellow Americans. I know it's a funny greeting, Happy 4th of July. Is that the proper greeting, or is it Happy Independence Day? Belated Happy Independence Day. But in Canada, of course, you don't pay attention to Canada too much, but we had our Canada Day just 5 days ago. But happy belated 4th of July to all the listeners who are Americans.
All right, thank you.
And happy belated 2nd of July to you as well. So, and to our Canadian listeners, and hopefully to all of you, wish you all good Sunday, and Yali Madad. Yali Madad, everyone. Thanks for having just joined our critical conversation around justice and social action in Islam. We want to provide some time, given everyone's excitement around the topic, to deep dive and sort of provide some more insight around a particular topic area that came up. So pose this question to Farouk and Halim for the audience. Give us more insight a little bit on the historic champions of justice within the Muslim tradition, but also other faith traditions, stretching all the way back to the initial founding of Islam and coming all the way back to today. Farouk, maybe you can provide us some of that historic lens, and then we'll come a little bit forward with Halim.
Well, yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. Of course, we know of the major figures, at least starting even with Prophet Muhammad. And as I said, one way to see him is very much as a social justice reformer, in fact, a revolutionary. And then we have, these iconic figures. But in terms of actual research on social justice movements, the way we understand them today, we would not have too much information. But one thing is clear, that unfortunately, it was a highly volatile situation politically. And a key question that was raised by Muslims was, who is the just ruler? Is there a just ruler? And so right from the time of after the death of the Prophet, there was a group of the Kharijites who in a sense were these rebels, wanting to somehow make sure that the leader exemplified from their point of view, these ideals of justice. But I think one of the very interesting things is if one, for example, looks at the role of charitable work throughout Muslim history, there was this institution of the Waqf establishing these endowments, which could be anything from schools to hospitals to creating sanitation systems, allowing drinking water. So even if you were to go to any one of these old cities today, whether it be Damascus, Baghdad, or even Istanbul, you will see the markers of these incredible generosity of not only people from the ruling families, but even the wealthy individuals. And that form of giving, which went beyond just giving what was prescribed by the faith in terms of zakat, and that to me is a form of social action. But probably an area that more research has to be done on, maybe it's done, I just have not accessed it, is the role of the Sufi Kanakas. As you know, there were the Sufi groups became these tariqas, and they basically were able to be this, in some cases, self-contained communities within these sort of, areas where there was political rule. But there were, of course, widespread communities, and people traveled. And one of the major places of hospitality for travelers were these Sufi Kanakas, which are then also connected to the caravanserais that were connected to these Sufi Kanakas. And to this day, I mean, even in modern history, let's say from the 20th century onwards, whenever there's been political agitation, you have the Sufi groupings involved in this. It was clear in Chechnya that much of the resistance came from these Sufi groups. Even in the Arab Spring that took place in many different Arab countries, you didn't only have the brotherhood, the Ikhwan, or the groups connected to the mosque, but you had participation of these Sufi movements. And I can't help but thinking that many of you may have heard of Mansur al-Fallaj, or another figure later, Surawardi. We often say that Mansur al-Fallaj was this ecstatic Sufi who said, "Ana al-Haq, I am the truth." But the very fact he was executed. Why was he executed? I mean, why him saying something? Why was it seen as a threat? So there's more to the story than just somehow him saying something that was seen as, from their point of view, as blasphemous. It was more than that. He was seen as someone who was challenging the values of that society, and Surawardi later. But I think that's one way to think about people that we can see as exemplifying these ideas of trying to make a better society. And they would often probably use notions of jihad, which is the greater jihad, of how to change ethically. And this is the work that they did.
Halim?
Yeah, from a historical context, it's the role that religion and religious institutions has played in social justice, I think, is a mixed bag. One of the things that we notice is that religion can be a very powerful vehicle, and religion institutions can be a very powerful vehicle in social movements because it already has a built-in mechanism for organization. And it also contains with it a sense of moral authority. The danger, of course, comes when that moral authority is supported by this idea of universal truth. Because then, as has just been referenced, you have notions of blasphemy, and any amount of disagreement or dissent within that movement can be seen as blasphemous. And you've seen this with religious movements throughout our history. So, on the one hand, you have the church being a major supporter of the institution of slavery at this country's foundation, but then also a major source of the abolitionist movement. You have religion being a powerful force during the civil rights era, either through the Nation of Islam or the Southern Christian Leadership Council and a variety of Jewish organizations in support of social justice. And then you also have a lot of faith-based groups, certainly nowadays, that are engaged in promoting discrimination against certain minorities, certainly minorities based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so it's, I like to think of religion or religious institutions as sort of a flame or fire, in that it can provide heat and it can provide warmth. And in fact, to a certain extent, you need it to survive, but it can also burn everything down. And so it's ultimately a question of the human handlers of how those forces are going to be used.
Yeah, and
no, appreciate.
yeah,
Go ahead, Farouk.
And I think when we were talking earlier, you talked about these prominent religious leaders in civil rights movement, right? I mean, Halim, you were mentioning some of these, the coalition of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religious leaders. We often think of them, Martin Luther King, or I don't know if you want to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when someone like Martin Luther King spoke, he spoke about social justice in morality terms, and in ways that connected with people profoundly beyond just, you know, what kind of society we want to live in, but what kind of people we want to be, and are we living up to our responsibility as God's creation? Certainly, you know, Mahatma Gandhi spoke about social justice in religious terms as well. Malcolm X, you know, both before and after his transformation, spoke about, you know, social justice in ways that was colored by his view of Islam, initially as one that was very race-based, and then ultimately, before he died, a view of Islam that was more inclusive and more universal in its view of people from different races and different backgrounds. But I think the capacity to speak to justice from a moral and religious and ethical combination is what gives the force, I think, to some of these religious movements.
No, that is fascinating. You're right. I mean, people often think about religions without this taking into this dimension. They almost think that religions are these sort of static institutions, but in fact, social justice is very much part of that history. You know, there was one term I don't think I explored sufficiently that's in the Quran, which actually refers to justice. We talked about adla and we talked about mizan, but there was this term called wasata, which actually is, again, difficult to translate, but the Quran uses that we have made of you an ummatan wasatan, an ummah wasatan, a just community, a moderate community, a middle community. And this idea of finding that balance is also very central to the way I think Muslims have thought about justice. And that's a key concept. And there's this other word, qist, which is sometimes often interchangeable with adla. But just to say that, yeah, you have these concepts. And then in addition to that, as jurisprudence evolved and it went beyond interpreting what was there in the sources. So, you know, if they wanted guidance, they would go to the Quran. If it wasn't in the Quran, they would go to the Hadiths. And if it wasn't in the Hadiths, then they would use legal reasoning in terms of analogy and what they call qiyas, and then coming up with consensus. But then they moved to this area which we would be very familiar with, Halim. They were areas of moral reasoning. And the concept was maslaha, which is public welfare. What I think today in legal terminology, you talk about public interest. What is the public interest here? So maslaha was a way in which you talked about justice in this non-formulaic way, because you actually had to think about what is going to serve public welfare, public utility. And the other term was istihsan, which is, again, difficult to translate, but what judgment or what decision is going to enrich the case, the decision at hand, with goodness? Or how is it going to improve it by moving it towards a more, I don't want to say virtuous, but you know, you have these areas that judges are always trying to figure out. What are these moral reasonings that you have to also go through?
I think this is a really interesting concept too, because in some ways, our approach, or the approach of people towards their religion, is, I think, it aids their impact as far as movements and social justice is concerned, but in some ways it detracts from it, because it's kind of a great irony. When you talk about, you've mentioned this concept of a just community almost being synonymous with moderate community. Well, moderation is not something that we normally associate with religion. Most religious adherents to any religion, if you were to ask them, you know, what is your level of devotion? No one's going to say moderate. In fact, they would say they're, you know, all-encompassing, passionate, devotionate, almost extremist, right? And in some ways that's counterproductive. What a lot of people don't realize is, if what you know about Islam is what you see in countries like Saudi Arabia, you think of Islam as being extremist. But as you know, and as many scholars of Islam know, there is so much written in the Quran, especially about moderation and about excess being a bad thing and moderation actually being a good thing. And that actually dovetails, I think, quite nicely with some of the founding fathers in the United States, what their view was. So much of the Constitution was written in a way to make governance, what Hamilton referred to as good governance, dispassionate and moderate, and a protection against extremism. And so on the one hand, I think it's important to be passionate about your cause and passionate about your drive and efforts towards social justice. But ultimately, at the end, it's your ability to be moderate and to be sensible that will yield you the best results in a pluralistic society. Because if everyone's an extremist in a pluralistic society, there is inherent conflict. And the extremism can only go so far. So I think it's very important for all of us to believe we have to use your whole body and soul, right? Your spirit, your heart will provide the passion, and your brain or your intellect will provide the reasoning and the moderation. And so you almost want to think of it, if you're driving a car, you need your passion on the gas, but you need your brain on the brakes in order to drive the car without colliding with somebody.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. And Ismailis, no matter what people's attitudes are towards our community and our history, one thing is very clear, is that we've always had this very, very central, almost signature element of interpreting scripture, going beyond the literal to the batin. And this idea of this sort of hermeneutic engagement constantly, not only with the scripture, but even with thought, it's clearly something that makes us, in a way, not fixed. And there's an element of moderation that is always there, because we're always trying to figure out how to interpret the text according to the circumstances and the changing conditions in history. And this is the notion of ta'wil. And ta'wil is seen as threatening, as you put it, by people who feel that that's somehow deviating. It's not orthodox enough, and that's seen as a threat. And of course today, we see the way in which the Imam works. He's someone who's constantly, even in his guidance to the Jamaat, always leaving room for us to reflect on that guidance rather than being prescriptive.
What about a different way to kind of interpret this notion of moderation or middle way? And I hear you on kind of this notion of extremism creeping into kind of our dialogue and our action. But in Islam, we have this notion of self-reliance. And we also have this notion of kind of compassion for those who are suffering from injustice, for example. How do we moderate those two by fostering a climate of self-reliance, by enabling others, but at the same time providing that helping hand that's needed and providing those resources of fixing that systemic injustice?
Well, I think, it's, like a lot of the different themes we've talked about today, it has to be a combination, right? You can live within a construct in society that allows room for disagreement. And that's where the moderation comes in, so that you can disagree without seeming blasphemous and without being painted as evil. That's a necessary precursor to being in a fair society where everyone is treated fairly and everyone has room to express their thoughts and beliefs. This concept of self-reliance, I think, is also one that has to be viewed with some degree of moderation, right? Self-reliance means take responsibility for your own actions and do what you can for yourself. But it doesn't mean be so focused on yourself that you fail to see everyone around you. And so it's not a question of, again, all or nothing, right? Either everyone has to look out for themselves and nobody else, or everyone absolves themselves of any responsibility and it's all someone else's, the government's problem or society's problem. I think it's a little bit of everything. And we need to be able to see within ourselves the power that all of us have as citizens, as members of the Smiley community, as members of our own nation state, United States, Canada, or wherever. Because if we don't, we're really robbing ourselves of this idea of agency, and we're denying ourselves the power that we actually have. So I kind of feel like when we look at this concept of self-reliance, we should do so with a mindfulness to not only the power we have over our own actions, but also the power we have to improve the lives of other people.
And interestingly, that's how it actually would come across when reading the Quran. It's exactly that sort of outlook in terms of these two what would seem opposing sort of directions. So clearly, the Quran, when it talks about zakat and sadaqah and the idea of our responsibility to others, it in a sense, it's a signal to all of us that we have responsibilities and obligations. The term is mu'amalat. But the Quran is so conscious of affirming the individual believer's right in terms of their relationship to God, that it's a very individual relationship, and that there is no compulsion in religion, and that there's that famous ayah that, your faith is your faith, and this idea of your own conscience. And that, in that sense, yeah, there's a sense in which it affirms the individual in his relationship to God, but it doesn't necessarily preclude the ways in which how you live and how you translate the ethics, which is to participate in something collective. By the way, again, I've used the term fellow American several times. Perhaps I need to come and stay in America, but you have a great fellow American named Emerson, who I would in many ways think is probably been, again, many thinkers have influenced, but he really has influenced me very deeply. And his idea of self-reliance is precisely this idea of human agency and human potential and human creativity. He was, of course, talking about how America need not longer be dependent on thinking only in reference to Europe. That in America, we can create a new way of thinking. Partly it was religious in terms of his transcendentalist movement, but partly he was just saying, how does it mean to live a certain ethic where you realize that you fundamentally have more power than you recognize in shaping your own life. And that's very inspiring. I mean, that idea of self-reliance is very inspiring when it's about really so much about what goes by the name of therapy today is to instill self-belief, self-affirmation, and self-confidence, right? Because when you are faced with problems, how to come up with a narrative that tells you that you're no longer a victim. And that's where Emerson's seeds are of self-reliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, that's hopefully where hope starts to form, and then hopefully hope then kind of propels itself into kind of emerging out of the traps of injustice, if you will. We'll appreciate both of you kind of spending the extra time and kind of deep dive here, and hopefully the audience benefits from this. Thank you.